Film is young compared to other mediums of art, such as painting, writing, sculpting, music, but film is one of the few art forms that have a content rating requirements attached to it for general audiences, right next to video games, television, and kind of music. Film has gone through many iterations of censorship and rating requirements in the US, starting firstly with the Hays Code. I won't get into all the details or the history, but basically the Hays Code was a full-on censorship of films by Hollywood in order to juke government decency laws that were meant to impose on what film could contain. The Hays Code was in place from 1934 to 1968, and when Hays retired in 1945, they created the Motion Pictures Producers and Distributors of America, or the MPPDA, which later became the Motion Pictures Association of America, or the MPAA, which we now know as just the Motion Pictures Association, or the MPA, since 1994. The 60s introduced the age ratings in which we would be used to today. These original ratings from 1968 are G for general audiences, M for mature, which would later become PG for parental guidance in 1969, R for restricted, no one under 17 without a parent or guardian, and X, no one under 17 admitted. Thanks to Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, we were blessed with the PG-13 rating in 1984. It was decided the film was not mature enough to deserve an R rating, but it was definitely too violent for a PG rating, so they decided they needed to add an additional rating, thus PG-13 was born, and then X was actually changed to NC-17, or No Children 17 or Under, in 1990, and then X was just kind of relegated to pornography, which you probably see in pop culture as being the 3 X's or XXX. So as of 1990, that leaves us with G, PG, PG-13, R, and NC-17. These are all ratings that the MPA uses to guide audiences and parents to the content which is contained in film. 1990 is also when the MPAA at the time started adding descriptions to their films in order to provide more information as to why a film was given its rating. And then 2004 introduces advertising films based on the ratings in relation to other films of the same rating, such as the trailers you see before movies in the theaters when it says this film has been approved to accompany this feature, which you've probably heard as green band trailers. They're usually dedicated to being appropriate for most audiences, and then you have the red band trailers, which are usually containing much more explicit language and violence, kind of the R-rated preview, if you will. So that brings us to today. Currently, 2024, there has not been a single change in the MPA rating system since 1990, and all of the changes were made within the original 22 years of the MPA's conception. So it has now been 34 years. Films have changed dramatically since then, yet we have not seen any changes in the actual rating system since then. So with the leap in technology since 34 years ago, there has been a lot more superhero films, there's been a lot more gun violence, blood, gore, the F-bomb rule that has been kind of implemented. For those that don't know, basically PG-13 films can get a single fuck without getting an R rating as long as it's not sexual. But this has also been stretched to 2 times in certain dramas, specifically in non-violent movies such as The Social Network.
Raid around in your ridiculous suits pretending you were running this company?
Sorry! My Prada's at the cleaners! Along with my hoodie and my fuck you flip-flops!
Actually has 2 fucks in it. And if you want to count the remake of Red Dawn, there's a middle finger and I believe also a fuck. So PG-13 has been more mature than it's ever been. So to be clear, I do not believe in censorship of any kind. I believe you should be able to make whatever it is you want as long as you are not harming yourself or harming anyone else, except feelings. Feelings are totally acceptable. You can hurt people's feelings all you want. But I do believe that there is a lot in PG-13 films that are just too mature for 13-year-olds. In fact, 12-year-olds as well. And unfortunately, parents don't always have the time or the money or even the interest to observe any of the content or all of the content that their children might consume. So I believe there needs to be a change in PG-13 ratings by an additional rating added to the board, or a change in the ratings altogether. That being said, if we added an additional rating, such as a PG-15, that doesn't mean 13-year-olds can't see it, but it's to let parents know that maybe a couple more years should go by before a child should be able to watch whatever is inside of that film. And it's also an additional way for parents to just get a better understanding of the actual maturity rating between these. Because maybe not all adults also want to see R-rated films, but if a movie is too mature for a 13-year-old, it's immediately relegated for R films. And if some films, which I do believe there are many R-rated films that would probably get dropped to what would be a PG-15 rating, a lot more films would probably get more watches or more views and a bigger audience, because some adults might be more interested in something that's not as mature. So I believe this goes both ways. So I'll give you a few standout examples of films that I believe are too mature for a PG-13 rating, but not enough for an R, as well as R films that could have probably gotten away with a PG-15 rating. There's definitely a lot more than what I'm going to show you, including most films with gun violence involving death by literally the dozens sometimes in these PG-13 films would probably be a PG-15. So whichever film just came to mind to you when I said that, that film probably needs a different rating. By the way, this script was written almost a year ago. I'm just now getting to it, so this example is a little dated, but I think it still works. When I watched Guardians of the Galaxy 3, when it came out in 2023, I really enjoyed it, but the film was very dark and it had a very disturbing focus around animal torture, cruelty, slavery. It's specifically about Rocket the Raccoon, the character, and the process of the team trying to save his life. We discover how Rocket became a talking, intelligent life form far beyond a normal raccoon. And that's thanks to lab experiments that are equal to torture by scientists trying to create the next kind of intelligent life form. We also learn that Rocket's friends, while he was kept in experimentation, there's an otter whose arms are removed and replaced with metal rods and electronics, a bunny's whose limbs are limp and has spider-like arms stuck into its ribs, and a walrus whose entire back half was replaced with a wheelchair-like apparatus. These are very bleak depictions, and it's clear that they are done with malice in mind. And the film clearly presents it as horrific acts, going as far as to have the Guardians watch an off-screen hologram of Rocket's procedures and react to these, and you can hear them, and it's extremely disturbing.
Start the incision here. Keep calm. Hold it still.
I can't! It won't stop moving!
Why did he never tell us about any of this?
This is worse than what Thanos did to me.
Especially for a 13-year-old. Like, these are very dark and grisly topics for a 13-year-old to be observing and faced with. And no, you don't necessarily see the procedures directly, but that doesn't mean it's not happening or that the film isn't putting it up for display and showcasing these horrific acts. And that's not even including the fact that these animals were forced into a higher form of intelligence. It was taught speech, higher learning, and complete self-awareness just to understand then the concept that they were used as experiments as slaves and will never actually obtain the freedom that they were promised. So these are some crazy, dark, and albeit larger concepts for 13-year-olds, but of course the intense violence that the film also has, including the beheading of a pig monster, and then it runs around with its head literally in its hands. Another creature is subjected to experiments and given higher intelligence that are also very human-like. And the film is a pretty decent amount of what I'll call monster gore, which is no different from normal blood and gore, other than it's usually like green or blue, and it doesn't look like goo. I'm not talking about monster goo. I'm talking about literally actual, what you would call blood and gore, just a different color. And it doesn't look like something out of Men in Black, where it's kind of cartoony and over the top ridiculous. This is very realistic gore, just a different color. and all within a PG-13 Marvel property, and the description by the MPA reads as intense sequences of violence and action, strong language, suggestive drug references, and thematic elements. There's no mention of animal cruelty or torture, and I pulled this directly from films.com, the place MPA directly cites their ratings for classification. The only thing they have listed is thematic elements, which I believe is an entire issue in its own. From the MPA website, they describe thematic elements as thematic elements may include aspects of illness, death, coming of age, divorce, domestic problems, substance abuse, end of the world scenarios, and more. That is a very wide and vague set of parameters, none of which specifically include animal cruelty or torture, and the MPA cites that a film is never rated higher than PG-13 for theme alone. It is rated based on its content, what happens on the screen, and how the theme is depicted. As an example, a discussion of sensitive topics like suicide or abuse doesn't automatically mean a film will receive an R or even a PG-13. The rating hinges on the depiction of events. How graphic is it? How explicit or profane is the language used? There are guidelines that our raters try to take into consideration. And from the films I've seen that include this depiction but lacking a specific description of elements, is that it seems to be a catch-all for other things that they don't necessarily describe in the snippet. So in this case, it seems that animal cruelty, yet the MPA website contradicts that, meaning that the animal cruelty either wasn't worth mentioning, even though it's a core element to the film's narrative, or they decided that thematic elements was enough to cover it, which I believe is a very large oversight on the MPA's current rating model. Another example of the MPA descriptions lacking context is for the film Taken. Rated PG-13 for intense sequences of violence, disturbing thematic material, sexual content, some drug references, and language. The film is about a man trying to find his daughter after she's abducted during a European trip, and throughout this action-packed adventure, he finds women drugged up, clearly against their will and used for sex. He later finds his daughter in an auction for sale while she's drugged up to her eyeballs, wearing nothing but lingerie. All of which clearly points to drugged and forced sex work, rape. Yet the MPA states that sexual content and disturbing thematic material, but does not indicate that these two are related or attached. 13-year-olds might walk out of the theater confused and curious as to some of these scenes depicting sex abuse and forced prostitution, when a parent probably didn't expect something like that to happen. Again, nothing in the film, I believe, would necessarily constitute an R rating, but PG-13 is a light sentencing for a film revolving around abduction, sexual abuse, forced prostitution, and of course, a lot of action gun violence. For my next example, we're going to look at a specific scene from the 2010 remake of True Grit. There is a scene where the character Rooster, played by Jeff Bridges, is interrogating two outlaws in a cabin. At the peak of the interrogation, one of the outlaws stops the other from exposing information by cutting his fingers off, then stabbing him in the chest. The character Rooster then stands up, shoots the assaulting outlaw point blank in the face, and this is a very graphic depiction of gun violence, as the camera does not cut away at all. And after the outlaw gets shot, we see him go limp and fall onto the bench. And then we cut to Rooster's bloody face. All of the violence throughout the film feels very real and very grisly as a whole, giving it a very dark atmosphere throughout the film. Now, I don't believe this single scene should warrant the film being restricted to adults only, but I also don't think that it's really appropriate for 13-year-olds, hence something like a PG-15 rating. And to reiterate, that doesn't mean a 13-year-old can't see it. That doesn't mean that an adult can't choose that their child that is 13 years old can or can't handle it. I believe they can do what they want. I just believe something like a PG-15 rating would assist a parent in knowing that it might be a little more violent than all of the other Marvel films that are rated the same thing. Another great example for PG-15 rating would be the 2007 animated film Beowulf, created by Robert Zemeckis, the same guy who brought us to Polar Express literally 3 years earlier, brought us this gore-ridden film depicting the poem of Beowulf. Between beheadings, dismemberment, and enough blood and gore to rival a Saw film and brutal deaths, this film would have easily been an R-rated feature had it been live action. But because of the animated nature of the film and that most of the violence is conducted against monsters, must have been what granted this the passing grade for PG-13. This being one of the most violent animated films, I think, of all time, I still don't think an R rating would have fit the bill, as many other elements of the film don't push that R mark, but again, somewhere in the middle, like a PG-15, would have been the perfect choice. It's violent enough to push the bounds of PG-13, but not so much that it would deserve an R rating. Now, let's look at the other side, R-rated films that probably would have been completely fine with a PG-15 rating. I think one that we all know would be The Breakfast Club, a film that probably would have been PG-13 today, or pretty damn close to it. Still had some sensitive topics, it still had language throughout, and that's kind of what pushed the boundaries of PG-13, giving it a restricted rating. But had we had something like a PG-15 rating, it would have perfectly suited a film like this. They're high school kids. It's how 15, 16, 17-year-old kids would talk and act, even today, which actually today probably significantly worse, but it would have perfectly fit something like that rather than being restricted to only adults. Another example that you may not have realized is The Matrix. The Matrix is rated R for sci-fi violence and brief language. That's it. That is all the MPA states for The Matrix. The violence depicted are mostly against quote-unquote simulations, all of which is bloodless. Any sexuality in the film is very minimal, more quote-unquote thematic, which didn't even make it in the MPA's description, and the language really isn't all that bad. It kind of makes this the perfect candidate for a PG-15 film. And honestly, the film probably would have gotten a PG-13 rating today. One of my favorites that I believe would sit perfectly in that PG-15 rating as well is Constantine, another Keanu Reeves film that wasn't on purpose. A film that's not overly violent, overly bloody, or really have that much mature language in it other than, let's say, thematic elements, working with the MPA's rules here. It was probably rated R for its overall dark themes and topics, such as death, suicide, and of course its dealings with Satan and demons. And the MPA's description is just violence and demonic images. Clearly someone on the board must have been Christian, because if we look back at that rule, something wouldn't get rated PG-13 or R just for its thematic elements, yet this film seems to have been rated R for its elements of demonic images. So I don't know, it feels like they kind of go against themselves here. Do you know how the MPA films are rated? Which I think is going to really explain why there seems to be a discrepancy. This is where it gets interesting and a little weird. Right on the website, it says ratings are determined by the Classification and Ratings Administration, CARA or CARA, via a board comprised of an independent group of parents. CARA is separate from the MPA, made up of somewhere between 8 to 13 parents who do not work in the film industry, have children between the age of 5 and 15 when they join, and they stay with CARA until their child turns 21. The CARA members watch a film together, determine the rating of the film as a group, and come up with a description together. This is about all the information I can find about how CARA works. I actually wrote an essay about this topic back in college years ago when I tried to even find more information and couldn't. I believe they keep this information Fort Knox locked down because I'm assuming they don't want people as part of the film industry to realize who is part of this, how this works, so they can try to manipulate and maybe bribe for a film to get a specific rating. This also means that ratings are determined by a panel of parents who presumably cycle out every so often, which is what can make the ratings inconsistent because a group or a panel that rates one movie might not be the same panel that rates another movie. It's a smart way to conduct the process, I think, on paper. A diverse group of parents choosing what is or is not acceptable for children to watch based on what is in the film. But the issue is the jump from PG-13 to R is a 5-year gap in 5 years is a lot during your formative teen years. Maybe not so much as an adult, the difference between a 25-year-old and a 30-year-old is not nearly as significant as a 13 or a 17-year-old, which means a 13-year-old presumably is mature enough to see everything that's on screen. Meaning preteens are apparently old enough for sexual abuse, prostitution, gun violence, animal cruelty, terror, death, torture, blood, and gore. But of course, some of these elements depicted in the correct way might be suitable for 13-year-old, but definitely not all of them, and definitely not all 13-year-olds. So I feel like I need to continue to reiterate, I do not believe in censoring films. I don't think that we should be restricting films or film content or what people can or can't do in their films. Like I said, as long as no one is being harmed in the making of films, I believe they can touch on any subject matter, and I actually insist that people touch on subject matter that might be considered taboo. Otherwise, the medium will just flatline, which I think it, in a way, kind of has in the last 10 years, but that's a completely different conversation. I do think the MPA has an obligation to make it as easy as possible for parents to understand what is in a film and make a good, at this point, guesstimation as to whether or not something is appropriate for their children. And I think that there is a major opportunity for the MPA to improve their current rating system with an additional rating and much clearer descriptions than what they currently use. For example, the Netherlands rating system, also used in a few other countries, called the Kijwasjur. I'm so sorry, I have no fucking idea how to say this, and Google Translate didn't help at all. Basically, it's translated to viewing guide, and it has a breadth of options when rating a film, starting with all ages and then rated by age: 6, 9, 12, 14, 16, and 18. Any child younger than the age listed cannot see the film without a parent or guardian, except for the 16 and 18, which are restricted to the age listed and above. These ratings are also listed with symbols to indicate what the film contains, letting audiences know what to expect when seeing a film. So to equate this to our current MPA ratings, AL would be all ages or G, 6 and 9 would fall under PG, 12 would be PG-13, and 16 would be R, meaning that there is an additional rating between PG-13 and R, in this case, 14. There's also an additional rating from 6 to 9, which means even PG has 2 indicators of content, because even some PG films, such as the animated Spider-Verse films, are rated PG, yet there are some elements that may not be suitable for a 16-year-old, therefore rating it such as 9 would let parents know that maybe there are a couple of mature elements in the film that a 6-year-old might not understand, comprehend, or should see. In fact, going to the website and looking up the film, Across the Spider-Verse was in fact rated 9. And the website even has the ratings for each individual aspect of the rating and descriptions, from images of terror, violence, sexual content, if it has any. Remember my example of True Grit and Taken from earlier? They were both rated 16 by the rating board, equivalent to R by the MPA. Tasks is the film Taken. It must have been translated by title, but if you look at the image, it does seem to be the same thing. With everything I've represented, I believe the answer would be at least one additional rating, as well as an extension of films reaching the NC-17 rating, as I believe that there are probably many films that are rated R or unrated that would qualify for an NC-17, yet NC-17 has become such a taboo thing that Hollywood specifically are very scared to reach that point. So there is a shot in the film Blonde, a biopic about Marilyn Monroe, including speculations about her potential relationship with JFK and eventually her death, where we do see her giving the president an unconsensual handjob and fellatio, also known as rape. And from a close-up of her face, we can hear her thoughts during the act of fellatio. This is then followed by him grabbing her by the mouth before we cut to her waking up in a drugged state. She's then dragged away by the Secret Service. And this scene alone is what I believe is what gave the film an NC-17 rating. And while I personally and honestly did originally believe that that seemed to be a harsh sentence, I think now I understand why something like this would qualify this film for an NC-17 rating. Sexual violence, as this scene very clearly shows, is one of the few qualifying elements that I believe should not be viewed by anyone under 17. Guardian approval or not, there are other films that should have clearly been rated NC-17 with this in mind as well, including films such as the original cut for A Requiem for a Dream, which contains explicit sexuality, nudity, and both of which are conducted under the influence under abusive and drug-related circumstances. These scenes were modified to make the R rating cut, but I believe NC-17 should not be that taboo. I believe, as the same as with the adults only rating by the ESRB, that we shouldn't be censoring our films just for public consumption. If something is going to push the boundaries and it's going to get a certain rating, a very high adult rating, I don't think that that should be considered a bad thing. Yes, children should not be seeing it. Younger people shouldn't be seeing it. Probably many people would not want to see a film that might have an NC-17 or an adults only rating attached to it. But that's the whole point of that rating, to make sure people understand, hey, this has very mature stuff in it, and this is not for everyone. Because almost no one bats an eye to R-rated films. No one really bats an eye to M-rated games. It just doesn't happen. Like, it's seen as normal, even if that film might have something in it that you don't want to experience or someone else might not want to experience, because it's all encapsulated under the same rating. It kind of gives light to a lot of the much harsher things that are in those films. And like I said, I believe by not rating things NC-17 or adults only and considering those ratings, like in the adults only specific, you won't sell them on storefronts. That is legitimate censorship. That is actual censorship. That's saying, oh, if you got this rating because your product is so mature, we're just not going to sell it. That is censorship. And I don't believe in that at all. So if you watch my film reviews or any of my videos where I talk about anything media related, I'm going to show my own personal rating system. And that rating system goes as this: AA for all ages, 6+, 9+, 13+, 15+, 17+, and 18+. Each of these ratings indicate the age I personally believe are old enough to absorb the content in whatever it is I'm rating, with the exception, of course, of AA for all ages. And then, of course, 18+ would be your MPA equivalent of NC-17 or the ESRB AO only. Things that I believe only adults should be consuming, regardless of parental whatever. But like I said, it's my own personal rating system. And this is kind of my way of letting you know what I believe the film should have been rated and why it should have been rated. And I'm going to include information as to why I decided to give it a specific age rating. I call it the universal rating system. I know, very clever and original. That's because it's a system I can use across all forms of content, whether that be films, television, games, books, if I pretend like I can read, even albums. I just feel like, as someone who's going to discuss and specifically review media, I believe I have an obligation to let you know the content within that media, especially if I don't touch on an aspect of something that might be in that media. You don't seem shocked when you proceed to go and play it, watch it, read it, view it, and then are surprised by something that I may not have mentioned. And yes, the MPA more than likely didn't mention whatever it is either. The ESRB may not have mentioned it or have a specific enough instruction about what's in it. So it's just kind of my personal way of letting you know what's inside of something that I'm reviewing, talking about. That way, even if you do use the ESRB or the MPA or any rating system, I at least can tell you what my experience was, how old I believe someone should be, the actual content within, and my content descriptors will be a bit more specific about things inside rather than just thematic elements. Okay, well, that's it. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to listen to me ramble about shit that probably doesn't matter to anyone's actual lives. It's just a nice excuse to use my film studies degree for something and my ever-crushing debt. So I hope you guys have a great day. Like I said, again, thank you so much for watching. So hit subscribe if you want to watch more videos. Like the video if you like the video. Comment, am I fucking nuts? Am I stupid? Should this exist? Am I just talking over my head? What do you think? Have you ever watched something as a kid that you were like, why was I allowed to watch this? I would be very interested, because there's definitely a lot of movies that I watched growing up that I more than likely shouldn't have, but too late now. Thank you guys again, and see you in the next one. Peace.